Hello everyone, welcome to JTV. What if I were to tell you that many of the tropes and accusations leveled against Israel, colonization, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, all these things, what if I were to tell you that they did not have their origins in the Middle East, but actually were carefully constructed in a land far away, in the Soviet Union? Would you be shocked? Well, it turns out this actually is very much the case. And our guest today is here to tell us all about this. And it's been research that she's done for a long time, and she's dug deep into the Soviet history of anti-Zionism and contemporary left-wing anti-Semitism. Absolutely fascinating. And when I first heard about her through David Hazoni, I was so curious to get her onto JTV. We're joined by Izabella Tabarovsky, who is a scholar of, as I said, Soviet anti-Zionism, contemporary left anti-Semitism. She's a senior fellow with the Z3, or Z3 if you're American, Institute for Jewish Priorities, and a research fellow with the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. Izabella, thank you so much for joining us on JTV from Israel. Really greatly appreciated. The first thing I'd like to do before diving into this topic in depth is just to understand, just briefly, your own background. How was it that you got into this whole can of worms?
So first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak to your viewers. So I grew up in the USSR, emigrated to the United States in 1990 at the age of 20. We emigrated as most Jewish families at the time. At that time, very like over 1 million Jews left the country because of anti-Semitism, as well as because of wanting to have a better life. But anti-Semitism was a very big part of that experience. And after we emigrated, I forgot about anti-Semitism for decades. Never experienced it when applying for jobs or for schools. You know, these were kind of the main places where Soviet Jews encountered anti-Semitism, which presented itself, by the way, as anti-Zionism. So never saw it until I think around 2018 or something like that, when I saw an item on the news where there were demonstrations on a campus with the placards, which are now so familiar to us: Zionism is racism and Zionists are Nazis. And I saw it, and something familiar sort of flickered in the back of my mind, but I felt really confused. I couldn't understand why I'm seeing that here in the United States in 2018. And I called my dad and told him about it. And I said, Dad, here's this demonstration on a campus, and they're saying these things. And they're saying, by the way, that they're just being anti Zionist and they're not being anti Semitic. And my dad just burst out laughing and he said, well, this we've heard before. And I thought, wow, we really have heard this before. This really kind of, the proverbial light bulb went off in my head. And I started looking into it. I started going through my own memories and I started researching what was it that we really experienced back in the USSR, because we didn't really process it that much. And I realized that everything that we're hearing today, we used to hear back there. And that's how the whole thing started.
Wow, 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 wow! It's fascinating, and it's interesting because I'm reminded of a quote of Dr. Inat Wolf, who recently said that we're actually living in a time now, since really October 7th, where this whole veneer of it's just about the Zionists that we have a problem with. It's no longer serving its purpose. Now they can just come out with their blatant Jew hatred. But let's now go into the history and to understanding this. I wonder if you could just take us back to the early roots of the anti-Zionist, really anti-Semitic construct in the Soviet Union, particularly as many people are under the impression that initially the Soviet Union was quite supportive of the State of Israel and its founding.
Well, so it's complicated. So the Soviet Union was supportive of the establishment of Israel, it's true, and that was in 1947, but that lasted for only a year. Throughout their history, the Soviets were really actually always anti-Zionist. And this is something I often, when I lecture, I tell this story in some detail because I think it helps us understand why is it that the left today is so anti-Zionist? It is actually deep in the roots of socialist, various variations on socialist and communist kind of ideologies, uh, starting with Lenin and Stalin, really. And you could, some people connect it further to Marx. Marx said a lot of things about Jews, but he didn't actually say anything about Zionists. He lived before that. But when you go back to early Lenin and Stalin, 1913, they already are speaking against Zionists. They view Zionism as a nationalist project, and communism and socialism, Bolshevism are internationalist projects, right? And so in that, they already view a contradiction. They view Zionists at that time in the early 20th century are trying to fight for the loyalties of the Jews and attract them into the Zionist project, right? To get them to go to Palestine or prepare to go to Palestine. Whereas the Bolsheviks are also fighting for the Jews, who are the most oppressed group in the Russian Empire. And they see Zionists as something of a competition in this and ideological enemies. And they start to say, well, Zionists are not real Marxists. You know, there is no such thing as a Jewish nation, which was the Zionist main claim. They say that Jews need to join the internationalist struggle for their class rights. What they're saying is that you have to look at Jewish poor, the Jewish workers need to join the proletariat of the world and fight for their class interest. And the Jewish bourgeoisie is just as terrible as bourgeoisie everywhere in Germany and in the UK and in the US. So we need to fight them. Jewish workers need to fight them. And Zionists want to unite all the Jews as a nation. So that it starts there. And without going too deep into details, so you have essentially Zionists are always on the outskirts. In the 1920s and really throughout the Soviet history, they're persecuted viciously. In the 1920s, they're sent to the Gulag, they're executed. Stalin, after the war, they're sort of anti-Semitic campaigns that have a very strong anti-Zionist component to them, but then with the exception of the support for the state of Israel. But the reason that he supported Israel is because there were geopolitical reasons. He believed that Israel would be socialist and pro-Soviet and Stalinist, which a lot of people in the kibbutzim were that way. But the reasons are geopolitical. He hopes that Israel will help the USSR fight the British Empire in the Middle East. But then comes in 1967, and I think from our perspective, 1967 is really the turning point. That's when a really massive international campaign begins, targeting Zionism, targeting Israel, and propagating all of the slogans that we hear today throughout the world in multiple languages. And I think that that's really what we need to be focusing on.
Right, and that was obviously triggered by Israel's audacity to win a war of survival.
Exactly.
Okay. So what happened then? Explain to us what the shift was and what became the strategy, and why was it that the Soviet Union played such a key role in this new approach to dealing with Israel?
So in 1967, as you said absolutely correctly, Israel wins over Arab states, and Arab states are Soviet allies at that point. The USSR connects with them in the 1950s as it begins to kind of discover the rising third world, as it was called then, the post-communist world, or the post-colonialist world, and it wants to wield influence in that world, and it comes to wield a lot of influence in the Middle East, in Africa, also in Latin America. But the Arab states, in particular Egypt, are really important, and the Soviet Union arms them and trains them and supplies them, finances them, and they can't believe that Israel won over such a well-supplied, massive enemy that has the USSR behind it. And the Soviet culture, political culture, was always slightly, paranoid, not slightly, but quite a bit paranoid. And that's just what happens in totalitarian states. And this is only 15 years, basically, after Stalin's death, less than 15 years. So the security services are deeply paranoid. And conspiracists, that's really, it's not paranoid, it's what the word that I was looking for. They're very conspiracists. They believe in conspiracy theories. And so they begin to think, well, if this tiny country won over our allies that we supplied and financed, there must have been something bigger behind them. And so they believe that Americans are behind them, which was not the case in 1967. But they also start to look around and they see Jews everywhere. You know how conspiracy theorists and just make conspiracy theories always see Jews everywhere. But they look at the United States and they say, well, there are Jews in positions of power, there are Jews in the media, there are Jews in Congress, there are Jews in the labor movement, and they're all pro-Israel. And clearly they're all being manipulated from some center And the center, of course, is Israel. Israel is the center of this ideology, and the World Zionist Organization controls all of it, and all the Jews are subjected to the World Zionist Organization's will. And the thing that also kind of contributes to this buildup of conspiracism and paranoia is the fact that inside the country, Soviet Jews are really excited about the Israel's victory, and they begin to demand a right to emigrate, and they begin to demand a right to express their Jewish identity more openly, because by then the Jews are basically on their way to assimilation, and that already worries the Soviets. They feel like there's some internal trouble, and whenever there's internal trouble, they always look for external enemies. They think that externally this is being manipulated. And who do they think is manipulating it? Well, at the same time, outside the country, there is a movement for Soviet Jewry. So Jews are supporting Jews inside Soviet Jews to support their desire to emigrate. And so they see this as a massive conspiracy, right? So there's Zionists in Israel, and there's Zionist Jews in the U.S., and they're trying to provoke kind of Jews in the USSR to go against the Soviet Union and instill Zionist ideology inside of them. So they feel like this is a massive Zionist conspiracy operating against Soviet interests. And this is what really triggers them. And that's why they start to direct their efforts at literally multiple countries, in dozens of languages, up to 100 languages. They already had a well set up international structure for working with the media, for working with the local leftist groups, for working in the third world. They have a way to do that, and so they start to infuse their propaganda with anti-Zionist messages, including already in 67, they're starting to say that Israel is committing a genocide in Palestinian territories and in Gaza. Israel is an apartheid state. They very much, particularly in their messaging that's geared toward Africa and South Africa, they start to compare it with South African apartheid, because anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism anti-racism is such a big kind of aspect of the epoch. They also say, well, Zionists are imperialists, and they're colonialists, and they're racist. So they're trying to kind of speak to all the different communities or constituencies that they're trying to reach, the third world and the global left. And they succeed very much. It's a really, they do a very good job for themselves of instilling this ideology already. By the late 60s, by the early 70s, the global left is speaking in this language, and many people in the third world are speaking in this language.
So their concept was, let's create trigger words that would be words that the leftists would naturally object to. And
Yes.
what's their end game for them to for Israel to cease to be?
Well, this is interesting, because the Soviets actually never said that they are against Israel existence. This is one big difference between what we see today and what you saw during the Cold War. The Soviet diplomacy, its kind of consistent point was, no, Israel has a right to exist. Israel just needs to be de-Zionized. We need to remove the Zionist regime in Israel, liberate the Israeli people from this oppressive Zionist regime, and then everything will be okay. And what was the way to liberate it? Some of these options are still discussed today. Unitary state where all, Jews and Arabs are equal, that kind of a thing. But it's interesting that, of course, even as they never said that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, but they financed and trained and supplied the groups and states that in fact had genocidal intentions toward Israel. So it was this kind of double game. But what was their end game? I think the end game really was all of it during the Cold War. Everything that they did was ultimately directed at undermining the United States. So this was sold as a package. The United States is their main Cold War rival. So this goes into the package of, because they view Israel as a basically a tool of the United States, and also as a kind of forward, the what's the word I'm looking for, like somebody that goes forward, the vanguard of neo-imperialism, of American imperialism in the Middle East. And so they feel that if they undermine Israel, they will also undermine the United States, and this is really their main interest. I don't know if they had any other goals in mind. I think they were very pragmatic in the sense that, it's realpolitik. We do what's needed to be done today. I don't know if they had anything beyond that, but they were playing into the interest. They were very much also playing into what was kind of the crucial preoccupations of the new left, which wasn't, not all of the global left was openly sort of pro-communist. It was more complex in those days, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. However, the new left was preoccupied with the war in Vietnam, and again the third worldist kind of orientation, right, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist. So by giving them this rhetoric, the Soviets were very much kind of creating an ecosystem where if you were it was you were required to espouse certain beliefs, and these beliefs included being anti-American, anti-capitalist, uh, probably espousing socialist views, and also very quickly after 1967, being anti-Zionist became kind of this marker of your belonging in this ecosystem.
And to what extent did they influence the Palestinian zone narrative? The create, I remember reading somewhere, I don't know whether you can verify this or not, that the KGB were involved with creating the Palestinian flag and the whole strategy of saying, all right, we weren't able to eliminate Israel through all the other Arab states, so now let's create our own faux national identity as Palestinians in order to say that this is really all our territory and our land. Like, who inspired who, and what's the chicken and egg?
Well, that's a really good question. So first of all, on the question of that the KGB created the Palestinian identity, I don't, this narrative exists. It can be traced to a single source who was a fugitive Romanian intelligence officer. I've spoken to a lot of historians of the Middle East and of the USSR about this, and none of them agree with this. They don't think that, I mean, it's very tempting to think that, but I'm not sure. There are also other indicators. I think that the KGB had a complicated relationship with Arafat. It was more complex than that. I don't think that we don't have evidence. Let's put it that way. We don't have any documentary evidence, in fact, that the KGB invented the Palestinian identity, but they certainly supported various Palestinian terrorist groups. They were, my understanding is, they were closer to the PFLP. They actually had some people they recruited within the organization as their agents. But of course, they worked with the PLO as well. They trained them. Mahmud Abbas defended his dissertation in the USSR. Arafat traveled to Moscow. And so a lot of the Palestinian support actually went through the German Democratic Republic, because the Soviets were also very careful not to look as though they were supporting terrorism. Just purely on the diplomatic level, it was not going to serve their interests. So they directed most of the support through the GDR. But what's interesting, who supported whom? This is a really, or who inspired whom? This is a really interesting question. And when I say here, this is important, is that I don't think that the Soviets necessarily invented every trope that they used in their propaganda. I think that they were very omnivorous, and they were open to borrowing and incorporating from others. So they were very familiar with Arab propaganda, Arab anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist propaganda. They had close relationships in Arab states. We know that some of the Soviet propagandists who wrote these propaganda books against Zionism and against Israel had served. They were actually Arabists. They knew Arabic. They served in Arab states, in Egypt. And Egypt had a very strong anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist propaganda. So, and the Soviets were also very much attuned to what the Western intellectuals were saying. So, but I think that what kind of the biggest thing that they did was to take it and incorporate all of these ideas and make them look like they have some scientific theory behind them. They involved scientific institutes of the scholarly institutes of the Academy of Sciences. They paid a whole bunch of scholars to take all of it, everything that they all of the pulled out quotes from Herzl and founders of Zionism, where you could imply the way today's anti-Zionists do, that Zionists were racist and colonialist, etc. So they accumulated all of it, and they tried to create kind of a unified theory of anti-Zionism. And then, of course, the fact that they had this massive propaganda apparatus, that is what they did. They took what some unknown intellectual might have written and would have been forgotten. They took that and they just spread it all around the world.
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating. And at what point do you think all these tropes and these, the way they falsely caricature Israel as this ethnic cleanser and genocider and blah blah? Well, what stage do you see this starting to infiltrate towards the West and the Western left and college campuses and all that? How did it happen and when did it happen?
So my sense is that it becomes already part of the far left discourse in the left in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. This is what we see observers of that period note, that that's when all of a sudden, late 60s, early 70s, all of the various groups, communists, Trotskyists, New Left, various groups that are fighting, African American civil rights leaders, they're all suddenly adopting this language. So you can see that already at that point, in those first few years after the Six-Day War, they're all speaking in the same language. And observing this actually is what uh, moved me to do this research because, it's very clear that first of all, they couldn't have reinvented this language. You don't just reinvent a whole kind of system of
Yeah.
thought and terminology right from scratch. It was coming from somewhere. And so I started asking myself, where did it come from? And so we know that the Soviets, so they were using the media, they were using publishing media, they worked their diplomatic offices abroad with politicians, with journalists, with progressive groups, including progressive Jewish groups. So there is evidence of that. But also what I think was really important, and that's what I've written about in my latest piece in Tablet magazine, which is called Zombie Anti-Zionism. I think a really important channel of transmission of these ideas was all these various conferences that took place in the third world that the Soviets sponsored via various front organizations. And this is where you can see how some of the same people who attended these conferences then go back to the UK. It's best traced with the UK, but also to some extent with the US. uh, they go back to their countries and they are using the language that they picked up at these events. This is where they kind of the idea that today's propagandists use, right? You create a bubble. So today it's internet bubbles or social media bubbles. Well, back then you had to create physical bubbles. And the Soviets sponsor this conference. They bring people to this conference from all over the world and they introduce the speakers and they introduce the rhetoric, the anti-Zionist rhetoric. And I think that's where it really becomes normalized and that's how it becomes transmitted. And again, when these people go back to their countries, it's already part of their consciousness. They think in those terms because their peers are speaking that language. And this is how it becomes adopted, sort of like wildfire throughout the left wing, far left ecosystem. And I think that what's happened since then, now I don't, you can trace it through the 70s and 80s. We need to do more work to understand what happens to it once the USSR falls apart. But all of it is documented, and all of these people are still around. And at some point, it just becomes resurrected. I know that
Mm.
today scholars trace the kind of the resurrection to around 2001, which is when this Durban conference took place. The UN conference on racism took place in Durban in South Africa. That's when it somehow all got reborn. We need to understand better what happened there. But it was already part of the far left thinking and kind of thinking and views of Israel. And I think the difference that we see now is that this rhetoric is moving much, much more into the center. And this is what I think is becoming so troubling. It's becoming more of the mainstream political discourse. Before it had been outside on the margins, and now it's becoming respectable and legitimate.
Yes, yes, that is a great concern. I suppose the next question is really okay. Now we know that so much of these false accusations and this construct that they create about Israel originates with Soviets, and yes, that's very interesting, and yes, that helps us to understand its falsehood. Is this entirely, though, an academic exercise, or is there some practical use in which knowing this information can be of help?
Well, look, I think I'll tell you why it's important to know it. We all know the history of Nazi Germany, right? Why is it important for us to know about Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda? Because when we see it in the present moment, we can point to it and we can say, well, this is Nazi. This comes from Nazis, and Nazis were anti Semitic. And so we shouldn't be using this language. People do it very easily with far right rhetoric, right? But people do it very easily with neo Nazi rhetoric. We have a very hard time doing that with the far left rhetoric. I mean, I understand that for a lot of people, and this is another very big problem that we face right now, is that we did a very good job of putting Nazi ideology outside the state, kind of the space of legitimacy. Nobody did that with the USSR, right? Today, you say to a lot of people, it was Soviet, and they're like, well, so what? You know, Soviet Union was great. The Soviet Union defeated the Nazis, right? The Soviet Union was not anti-Semitic. This is what a lot of people, if they are taught anything today about the USSR, this is what they're taught. So that's already a problem. But there are a lot of people who do dislike the Soviet Union. So in addition to, like, we need to be fixing that problem, right? We need to be teaching the history correctly about, we need to be teaching about left-wing totalitarianism. It wasn't just Nazi Germany that destroyed the lives of millions in the 20th century. The USSR actually destroyed probably more lives than Nazi Germany. So we need to be teaching that. But I think for a lot of people, if you say that, look, this comes from a totalitarian state, this comes from a state that was anti-Semitic, that there is a very detailed record of what the USSR did to its Jews. It didn't put them in concentration camps, but it did murder some. And then there was a program of cultural annihilation. The idea was that in a couple of generations, there would be no more Jews because they would completely assimilate, right? The Jewish culture and religion was supposed to be completely wiped out. So if you tell people, look, it comes from a totalitarian state that was our enemy, that wanted us to be eliminated, then I think it perhaps puts doubt in their minds. I mean, I think that today our fight is for the mainstream, for people who, I think we need to sort of forget about the extremists. The extremists require their own de-radicalization program. But people in the mainstream, when there's so much disinformation. I wrote an article recently about Wikipedia, how Wikipedia serves as a tool of disinformation on Jewish topics and certainly on Israel and Zionism. And so everywhere people look, they get this information. So we need to be able to tell people this comes from a really very tainted source, to say the least. So I think that's number one. Number two, I mean, I know people often ask me, how can I use this to fight? Look, I think that there are no quick solutions. I think we need to teach people first. We need to teach people this history, and then perhaps we can start drawing some lessons from it. But I don't think that, or some, people always want talking points. I don't think that we can fight this through talking points. I mean, the problem is much deeper, right? On the far left, you have deep conviction. Again, it's a generational thing. It's been passed on for generations. So we need to take this seriously, and we will not defeat it through slogans, and we just need to recognize it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think one area in which it's all too relevant today, and it's important to know this and say this, is particularly around the Palestinian Authority president, Mahmud Abbas. And you've written about this on Tablet Mag, how Mahmud Abbas's dissertation was done in Russia. I think it was in Moscow on the collaboration between the Zionists and the Nazis, right? Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is one example where, for many people, it seems like, well, the USSR is long gone. Why even talk about it? Well, first of all, the answer is, the Nazi Germany is also long gone, and we still talk about it. It still influences our culture today. So we have to be talking about it. But it's not only that, people who came out of that culture are still around and active and still influence our culture today. So Mahmoud Abbas is one of them. There are others. Angela Davis, she's a big, I'll return to Abbas in a moment, but I just want to say, so Angela Davis is another person who came out of that ecosystem, she's a big kind of symbol, and she's adored on the far left, and she often speaks against Zionism in these kind of conspiratorial terms. There are other people in the piece, zombie anti-Zionism. I mentioned several people who, by the way, since you're in the UK, the Corbynistas, they all come out of that ecosystem. of the intersection of kind of Soviet third world Palestinian kind of interests. So they all come out of that. It's very present in our life and in our culture. Mahmoud Abbas, yes, he came to the USSR and it was kind of a practice there to bring students from the third world, again, as it was called back then, promising students who could become, and then who could become elites in their own countries and be pro-Soviet, right? Bring pro-Soviet kind of ideas into their countries and put their countries into the Soviet orbit. And so Abbas was viewed as very promising in that sense, and he was brought in on a scholarship, and he and then was put into a program at an institute which was really central to producing anti-Zionist propaganda. It was called the Institute of Oriental Studies. It was run by a Soviet Arabist and long-term kind of senior intelligence officer who came to head Russian intelligence after the USSR fell apart, Yevgeny Primakov. So he was there, right in the heart of the Soviet propaganda machine that was producing anti-Zionist propaganda. And his dissertation was actually unavailable for a very long time. When I wrote this piece, I still hadn't seen the full dissertation. You could only get a hold of like a 11-page abstract, which you had to produce in Soviet Academy. And so I analyzed it. You can see how it's completely built on Soviet propagandistic rhetoric. So the sources that he lists are sources produced by Soviet anti-Semites, literal anti-Semites, far right, conservative neo kind of fascist people with neo-fascist views who hid behind Marxist-Leninist rhetoric. So this is what the source of his ideas are. And yes, it was about he sort of tried to prove that the Zionists collaborated with the Nazis in the annihilation of Jews in the Holocaust. This is a story that continues to live today on the far left. It's one of the most popular stories. It's, of course, a complete lie. It's based on complete misinterpretation of events, distortion of events, fake facts. And this is what we see in Abbas's dissertation.
It's just unbelievable. It's really seeing what you want to see rather than actually seeing reality. And one other topical
Exactly.
issue, which we're discussing, is this actually academic or real? Is another some article you wrote in Tablet on Wikipedia and the disinformation that exists there. Can you touch on that for us?
Yes, that is really crucial. I mean, once I did that research, I realized just how bad things are. So, Wikipedia, I think it's really important that people understand that Wikipedia is not just wrong on a lot of topics. I think a lot of you'll see online a lot of people say, "Oh, Wikipedia, fake facts. I tell my students not to use it." But I think it's worse than that. Wikipedia actually, when it comes to topics, to Jewish topics, to Israel, to Zionism, Wikipedia is actually a tool of disinformation and propaganda. And you see how easy it is to subvert Wikipedia's processes, how to subvert its system, which is supposed to guard against just that. It's supposed to be a self governing system where people coming in with different points of view can actually create the fullest kind of articles and entries about any subject. In reality, it's all been subverted. It's no longer the mechanism that are supposed to guard the neutral tone are easily subverted. I bring there documented cases of how in the past groups of highly motivated users, anti-Jewish users, got together and essentially, again, I keep using that word, subverted the mechanisms to propagate fake news, lies, and they're gradually sort of culling their list of reliable sources to rid them completely of any sources that may express a view that differs from left-wing narrative on Israel and Jews. So I really hope people read it, and I think we all need to be putting pressure on the Wikimedia Foundation, which runs the Wikipedia site and raises money for Wikipedia. They try to wash their hands of it. We can't allow them to do it. We need to be putting pressure on their donors. And the main thing we need to, Wikipedia is one of the most visited sites on the planet. It's the fifth most visited site, and something needs to be done. We need to find a way to stop them hiding behind their anonymity, behind all of this, well, self-governing, crowdsourced knowledge. It doesn't work anymore. It's a real, I think it's a national, it's on a bigger level, it's a national security threat for democracies, because there are also documented cases of Iranian agents manipulating content, and this is just the tiny sliver of what we know.
Absolutely agree. And I know that we have UN Watch with Hillel Noy. I've been saying for a while, I think we need a Wiki Watch, to be honest, because
A
it
hundred
really is a
percent.
problem. Yeah, and I've seen
Yes,
time and time again a very biased approach, or even sometimes not biased, but just missing out key pieces of information, which
exactly.
is a form of bias, isn't it?
100%. I think what they claim to be neutral is really just a far left bias. And one of the things they do is, yes, they exclude the side of the story that's the Israeli side of the story. They just present the left side of the story. It is absolutely a form of bias. And I'll add one more thing. People like me, people who are scholars, we've known for a long time that you don't use Wikipedia's articles to kind of for perspective, right? But you often go into the list of sources and use them as a jumping off point for further research. Well, now I've also understood that we can't do that anymore, because their sources are also one-sided, because they're gradually, increasingly excluding sources that disagree with them. What triggered the writing of this article was that they included the ADL on their list of, like, they made it less reliable. They said that the ADL is not reliable on issues related to Israel and Zionism and anti-Semitism that's related to Zionism, meaning essentially left-wing anti-Semitism. So, and in the Jewish community, in the American Jewish community, people have different attitudes toward the ADL. But I think the important thing for us to understand is that this is part of the concerted attack on the Jewish story, on the Jewish people, on our sense of who we are, on our right to tell our own story. And I think it's really important that we'll understand it in that way and find a way to stand up to this.
Absolutely. And my final question for you, Isabella, would be, as a researcher of the history of anti-Semitism and all these issues that we've spoken of, what would be your one, if you could pick one message that our viewers could take away from this conversation, perhaps something they could look into more, something they could try to remember, to recall in conversations they have with people, what would that be?
I think my message is a message of defiance. I think we all need more of an attitude of defiance. I think in the face of this onslaught of anti-Zionist, anti-Israel rhetoric, I think a lot of people, they sort of they want to kind of go quiet and not challenge it, or even worse, I think sometimes they start to think, well, maybe they're right. It's this language of social justice, so maybe they're correct. I think this is where it helps to understand that the source of this is propaganda. When you understand that it's propaganda, the way we did, the way Soviet Jews did, none of us ever took this seriously. We knew that this was an attack on us, and so no matter how much they said it, it was like, no, no, I don't accept it. We couldn't really, only very brave people among us could fight it. They were people known as refuseniks. They stood up for all of us. Most of us didn't fight it, but I think we need that inner resilience and inner resistance and defiance to not let this propaganda convince us that it's actually correct. It is
I
not
think
correct. We need to stick to our own story.
that is so pertinent. And it's funny because I was actually speaking to a rabbi on one of my previous interviews recently, and we were talking about this quote in the Zohar, in a Kabbalistic text, which speaks of how the final exile of the Jews, the Ishmaelite exile, will be the most oppressive. And I said, really, the most oppressive? I mean, there's so much that's been oppressive in Jewish history. How oppressive are we talking? And he said, it means oppressive in terms, what makes it most oppressive is the psychological impact that it will have on the Jews. Is that this time we've been made to believe our own guilt. And this time we've been made to believe, it's like, in some ways, psychological games are because it's ruining your very own sense of self, your sense of integrity and principle and honor. And I thought that was really
Exactly.
powerful. So what you're saying is
Exactly.
essentially,
Now, This is fascinating, and and I say it from the experience of Soviet Jews that I've written about a lot, also in Tablet. People can find that, but yeah, 100%. It's really, really crucial right now. I think honestly, I think our fight starts with us. Before we can fight the anti-Zionists outside, we need to strengthen ourselves to really believe in our story once again.
Completely agree. Izabella, it was great to have you on JTV for the first time, speaking to us from Israel. I welcome the viewers to comment in the YouTube comment area. Let us know your feedback. Let us know if there's other questions or other topics you'd like me to speak to Izabella about. Would really appreciate that. Izabella, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work?
So I'm on Twitter, X, at Izatabaro, Izatabaro. That's probably the best way.
Great, great stuff. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
So much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.